Hey everybody, Daniel from Spacedock here, and we've just hit 100,000 subscribers, so I thought I'd celebrate with an unscripted video where I'm going to show off some stuff that I've been working on in the background. If any of you have seen the Future of Spacedock video, which I will link in a card around here, you'll know that I am working on what I hope will become a motion comic series to release to you all one day. I don't expect anything on that soon or anything. It's going to be a long process, and it's still being written. But early in the process, I decided that I would hold off any kind of location, vehicle designs, etc. until I brought on an art team after all the writing had been done. But the central ship of the story was, of course, the setting of many scenes that I was writing, and eventually, and this is quite a while ago now, I decided to draw up a deck plan just so that I could help visualize the setting while I'm writing. And eventually it spiraled into a sort of halfway house design for a ship. I'm not an artist, and such will be evident in the images you're about to see, but I thought I'd walk you through them because I feel like it might give you an idea of what I kind of like to see in designs, and maybe some subtle hints towards some fiction I'm producing that I hope you'll be interested in one day. So, here we have the Guinevere, referred to colloquially as the Gwyn most of the time. Immediately you can see that this is a pretty average drawing. I'm not a designer or anything like that, and I want to put ahead straight away that pretty much nothing you see here is likely to stay the same over the course of production, and I'm not going to talk about plot elements or anything like that. I don't want to spoil my own content, and as I said, it's all going to change most likely. But I should establish that the setting at least is in a sort of Battlestar Mass Effect kind of realism level, in that we've got artificial gravity plating, but not on all ships, and the aesthetic varies between groups and factions, but for the faction that hosts this ship, I'm centering it around a very grounded, big chemical engines, kind of NASA building warships type situation. So let me walk you through this. The first thing I want to point out is you've probably seen the big cross of maneuvering thrusters in the center. I didn't want to use... I wanted to make maneuvering thrusters into a central element of how everything works here, rather than sort of an afterthought. And, you know, I'm terrible at perspective drawing and everything, so if you look at those two bottom side-on images, you can see that the circles facing outwards. That's supposed to be the same thing. Yeah, forgive me, I'm terrible at this. Basically, those things are not sort of monopropellant jets like you would find on the space shuttle or whatever. They are full-on chemical engines, not as powerful as the main drive, obviously, but seriously powerful chemical engines, and there's 8 of them. They're all in ball and socket joints, and they move constantly. So the ship is going to be constantly arresting its momentum around its center of mass, using that whole module as a big lever. So you'll see those things firing all the time. Occasionally it will supplement its own forward thrust by firing the aft 4, the aft dorsal 2 and the aft ventral 2. If it needs to brake quickly, it'll fire all of the dorsal forward and ventral forward thrusters. When it needs to land, it will use only the bottom ones. They're all completely multi-purpose. So, I mean, essentially the ship is just a giant RCS cluster, which I really like the idea of. I think that's kind of original, and I think it's going to look good eventually when art is developed and such. But if we go to the what I'm calling the drift drive, which is the aftmost engine, this is, if you've ever played Elite Dangerous and used Super Cruise, which is kind of a high-speed, relativistic, interplanetary sort of drive, that's what's going on here. This thing... most of the time, like for example, if this ship was in a close quarters fight, there's a good chance that the main drive at the back would just be cold and switched off, and it would use the cluster of 8 drives to move around. If it wants to go forwards, it would fire the aft ones. Whereas this thing is interplanetary engine. There is no ship-mounted FTL in this universe. So there's nothing like that on the ship. As I've added a visual element here in the bottom right, you'll notice these heat sinks. I wanted to have a visual cue to indicate when the ship is going from, say, quickly navigating an asteroid belt to going from gravity well to gravity well. And I thought, you know, the drive's going to get hot, so I wanted the heat sinks to spread farther apart. They're articulated, and these large heat shield kind of V-wing style, and indicate the increased speed at which the ship is moving. If I can draw your attention to these wing-mounted autocannons here, I've tried to visualize this on the side view, but not very well, and I'll put up like a little thing to indicate it here. But basically, they're not wings, they're sort of extended hardpoints, and the actual gun segment of the assembly here is suspended between two sheets of metal, and the height of the gun is correct to slot through this gap. So the whole gun assembly can spin 360 degrees and fold through the hard point. So the same gun can be used to broadside or to fire off the aft or to fire forwards. It can't hinge up and down, but the ship is obviously maneuverable enough to roll to bring those weapons to bear. If you're interested in size, etc., I haven't laid out a specific size in meters for this ship or anything like that, but you can see the chap that I've used for scale on the loading ramp at the base there. This is, I've called it a Corvette. It's smaller than the SR-1 Normandy by quite a fair bit, I'd say. I think Corvette's probably the right term. But yeah, a bit bigger than the Millennium Falcon, that kind of thing. And if we go back to weapons, the two autoguns are, I don't want to say secondary weapons because they're probably used more often, but if we look at the top of the main body, which you can see on the left there, we have a coil gun, and I don't think coil guns are used enough in sci-fi. I quite like the idea. The Max from Halo are coil guns. If you've never looked into it, the difference between a coil gun and a rail gun is that a coil gun magnetically pulls the round out of the barrel, which means there's basically no recoil, whereas a rail gun uses two electrically charged rails and bridges them with conducting material to create sideways force, so there is recoil. But a coil gun is what we've got going on here, and I also have a pair of torpedo tubes. I call them torpedo tubes, but they're not torpedo tubes in the manner that you'd expect. They're more like slits or sideways deployment bays. I imagine, see, the torpedoes here, I've got them, there's a small description in the right. They'd just be jettisoned in clusters into space, free float a few meters until they're clear of the ship, and then they'd fire up their own RCS, orient toward whatever they're going towards, and fire their own engines. I can't see any reason for them to be fired straight forward out of tubes and for you to have to reorient the ship to point it towards whatever you're firing at. You're in space, the torpedoes are going to have a far better thrust to mass ratio than anything else. So the way I see it, you just push them out the ship, let them drift for a second, and then let them go towards whatever they need to go towards. And of course I have a loading lift for the torpedoes in the bottom left. It's not visualized here, but that loading ramp that the guy is standing on in the center is large enough for a scout rover, which I've called the Wildcat, and I say that it is just about large enough for that rover, so that should give you a kind of idea of where it goes. When the ramp is closed, the rover is suspended in the top of the cargo bay so that people can walk under it and still use the bay for cargo. And the last thing I should point out here is that the type of ship is called Huntress Class. I've actually, this is the only ship of its kind. It was originally called the Huntress until it was renamed by its captain. As I said, I'm not going into plot elements today, but I do have a running theme where all corvettes from this faction have a naming convention wherein all of the class names end in S. So I've got like Huntress, Protectress, Task Mistress, that kind of thing. And I like to see those kind of naming conventions in things, and I've tried to keep some kind of consistency with that as I've gone along. But I will now bring you into the ship for the deck plan that originally created this whole thing. So here we are on the interior plan, and I do apologise if it's a bit irritating that I haven't even told you what the name of this story is or any of the basic premise, and I do think it's quite an original premise. I'm very pleased with it, and I will explain this stuff to you at some point, but for the moment we're in such an early stage and I just wanted to do something for 100,000 subs, so you'll have to bear with me as I go through this. So the ship has 3 decks, although really it has 2. The third deck is little more than a crawl space, and you'll see why in a moment. But we'll start near the top and work down. I'm going to start on the main deck. Okay, so at the front here we have a probe bay, pretty straightforward. It's just kind of atmospheric probes, scout probes. I don't imagine this thing would be able to carry very many of them. This whole forward area of each torpedo bay and the coil gun loading area and the probe bay, it's kind of like one open space with a walkway over it. It kind of, if you want to picture the armory on the NX-01 in Star Trek Enterprise, it's that kind of deal. And as you can see, these little white arrows are ladder pits, and you'll see where that connects up to in a moment when I go to the other deck. But this, on the deck below, this is largely the same. This front area kind of moves across 2 decks. The reason I did that is because I wanted the torpedoes, when not in use, to have the deck plating between them and the bridge, so that if there was ever a onboard malfunction or a torpedo exploded in the ship, it wouldn't blow the bridge up. But anyway, as we work backwards, there are 2 hallways here on either side of the bridge, each of which is lined with escape pods. There are exactly enough escape pods for what would have been this ship's intended crew complement when it was constructed, and these are like single occupant kind of coffin escape pods, not large sort of multi-person pods. You'll notice that the bridge is buried in the center of the ship, Battlestar style. There are no windows. Well, I'm considering adding windows for, I'm sure at some point it will become like artistically logical to put windows into things just so that it looks good in the back of shots, etc. But the bridge itself is no windows here, no actual windows. And instead, there are holographic sheets of projectors across the walls, which give the illusion of windows. I can tell you what this bridge looks like because I envision it pretty much exactly as the cockpit of the lander from Interstellar, which I'll put a picture up of somewhere, which has kind of like rotating chairs to accommodate for G-force and a central console between the two seats with a couple more standing consoles behind it, etc. Imagine if you took the cockpit from the ship in Interstellar and you replaced all of the actual windows with illusory windows achieved through holographic projections. Okay, and moving backwards, the bridge leads straight onto the ops room, which is literally just a sort of briefing table. It's a very small briefing table room, a room that I have extensively used for expository dialogue, because it's just, stand around the ops room, talk about what's going on, that kind of thing. On either side of here, we have a port dormitory and a starboard dormitory. For various plot reasons that I won't get into, this ship does not have the complement it's supposed to. There are 3 people living on this ship at the start of the story, and so they don't need however many bunks and such this thing was designed for. So I imagine most of this stuff has been stripped out, bulkheads have been removed, and bookshelves have been put up, and decoration, and people have taken advantage of the fact that they have more space than the ship was designed for. As you can see, each of these dormitories has a ladder pit in, and you'll see where they lead to in a moment. So as we get back, we've got a main open hallway bit with nothing in, and that's connected to the CO's cabin and the med lab. These are the kind of rooms that I feel like we're probably going to end up having windows at some point, just because, as I said, I'm not an artist, but I think if I was to say to an artist that I have commissioned, I'm having a scene in this cabin, it's a room the size of a sardine tin with no windows, they'd say, that's going to look terrible. So, a window might be a decent idea there. But basically, pretty straightforward. Small CO cabin, small med lab. I imagine, if you think of the med lab, the little tiny medical bay on the Ebon Hawk in Knights of the Old Republic, where it's just like one bio bed and some consoles. It's that kind of thing. Maybe a tiny bit bigger, but that kind of idea. As we work back, we get to the cargo bay. There's 2 doors here so that you can depressurize, so that you can open the cargo bay doors in flight if you wanted to use it for an EVA, although there is an airlock, which I will get to in a moment. As I said earlier, this room would have the Wildcat Scout rover suspended above everybody in the room, and that could be lowered down if you needed to work on it for maintenance, lowered down even further if you needed to drop it out of the ship. Plenty of space in here for crates, materials, whatever. It's literally just an open cargo bay. And both of those upward ladders lead to the tiny crawl space I mentioned, which I'll show. In fact, I'll show that off now. As you can see, it's literally just an astrogation dome. It's just a tiny crawl space with some small navigational consoles and some like thick glass windows, transparent windows. Think of the cupola on the International Space Station. Basically that. This doesn't even qualify as a third deck, and it's here for a character reason that is I'm not going to get into. But yeah, that's why there's 3 levels of deck plan here. As we go back, there's another area with 2 bulkheads so that you can depressurize the cargo bay. This has the 2 remaining escape pods. And then back into the engine room, which is not a very large engine room. If I may continue applying comparisons, it's very much like the original series Star Trek engine room, where there's just a big wireframe grid with the engine behind it and some consoles, except it's probably a bit smaller than the TOS one. And that's the main deck. If we now go to the sub deck, and you'll have to try and remember where the ladders were. As you can see, all this front area, torpedo storage, coil gun ammo storage, extra munition storage, that's all under the probe bay, torpedo bay area from earlier on. This is basically the bottom of torpedo loading lifts. You just have a stack of torpedoes, a stack of coil gun rounds, you shove them into this thing and it'll go up a mechanical lift and be loaded into those slits to be jettisoned out and launched. You could see all of these rooms from the torpedo bays if you wanted to. It's just this one multi-deck area. As we work back, there's a very small hydroponics bay. This would literally just be a hallway lined with rings of plants, etc. for oxygen recycling. And opposite that, there's another hallway which is life support control, which is basically just where all of the controls needed to manipulate the environment in the hydroponics bay next door would be, as well as manipulating the ship's oxygen tanks and water supply and stuff like that. As we work back, there's a locker room and EVA bay, and if you remember the other deck, you'll know that both the galley here and the locker room are below the port and starboard dormitories connected by ladder pits. Locker room is it's just, it's a room with lockers in it. It's got space suits, and if you see where I've got airlock in the center here, this is a single person lift airlock. So you would stand in it, and then it would drop outwards out of the bottom of the ship, like extending. I'm going to go more comparisons here. Kind of like the thing that Lando uses on top of the Millennium Falcon in The Empire Strikes Back to fetch Luke, except it's on the bottom of the ship. Toilets and showers, self-explanatory. And there's the galley here, which, like I said, it would have been, because this ship was built as a rank-and-file warship, it would have had lots of tables and plastic chairs and all that, and looked like a cafeteria. And the crew who have taken this ship as their home have stripped all that stuff out and just put in a load of furniture, and it's just like a kind of chilled out lounge area now. So that was the Guinevere in its current form. Thank you for indulging me talking about a ship from a story that you won't see for a long while in very vague detail. But I'd love to hear what you think of the design below. Also, if you happen to be anyone who's worked on motion comics, anything like that, and feel like you're interested in this concept based on what little information I've given out, then I encourage you to contact me on Twitter, etc. In the vaguest possible sense, if you've ever watched the intro sequence to the enhanced edition of Baldur's Gate on Steam, there's a kind of animation there, very low motion animation with no, like, very, very kind of artistically framed. I think it's called like motion stills or something. That's the kind of thing I'm looking for people who can do. As I say, I'm still writing it. This could be months, maybe years away, but I'm always happy to make contacts in that kind of area. So if you are interested, please make yourself known. And thank you all for watching Spacedock for the last 2 years and for bringing in 100,000 subscribers, which is far beyond anything I ever thought I'd reach. And here's hoping we have 100,000 more very soon. This is Daniel from Spacedock, signing off. Thank you for watching Spacedock. Please remember to like, subscribe and share for more science fiction spacecraft summaries. If you enjoy the channel, why not consider pledging your support on Patreon? For just $1 a month, you'll be able to access the Spacedock schedule to see what's coming up.